Mm-hmm. Will it be notes, not mirrored? Poof, there it goes. All right. Hi. So today I am talking about learning the strokes. I teach typography, and this is very much an introductory course. It's a course that's a Type 1 class, so it is teaching students to love letters, basically, and teaching them that it's more than a skill. And again, this is a introduction to typography course, and but also understanding our Latin alphabet as a phonographic glyph system that when type affects the sound of the words as you read them, which then translates into meaning. And so to really get them to understand that the face of letters is the sound of letters. I teach just to give you some context, I teach at the University of Delaware in the US, which was established in 1743. There's 22,852 students at the school, not all of those in my department. It's a very classic campus, and many students think of it as a quintessential college experience. I teach in a department of art and design. We offer degrees in both graphic design and fine arts. And that's where Newark is, in case you're interested. You're welcome to visit. So in terms of typography, my belief is that design education is a physical education. Letters operate in the realm of Gestalt psychology, and to learn type is to understand the history and the technique and the visual form of our language. My Type 1 course is an introduction, as I said, to type from a historical perspective. We start with hand lettering, and then we move into letterpress. We have a fully functioning letterpress facility, which we do teach type in, and then we move on to other digital tools. And the idea here is to follow the trajectory of the development of typography through the modes of production. And overall, my students play with the balance of material and meaning in understanding typography, the balance of expression and legibility. And this is based on a core knowledge of how visual form communicates, which is also something that's echoed in their other courses inside the department. You could say it's this reciprocity between our perception and our cognition. And in our department includes fine arts, things like, and our students have the opportunity to take classes, or they actually have to take classes in things like sculpture, ceramics, painting, printmaking, and things like that, in addition to 3D modeling, typography, graphic design, and video and photography. I mentioned photography. So in this way, students they're engaged in this thinking through making all across the department, and where ideas are considered as just entryways into a process. Ideas are not the goal. It's just where you start. With this hand-eye phenomenon sort of inciting further exploration, learning from what you do, and then letting that incite your next level of experimentation. I don't teach in a computer lab. I do teach by getting students physically connected to their work. The basis of all type, as we know, is the human hand, and this is where we start. Our alphabet, all alphabets evolved from written script, as very apropos to come after the Demotic, and it's through hand lettering that I feel type is best learned. Students must see letters as constructed through strokes of the hand and not as shapes, with the form being a direct result of the tool of production. So we start with the most basic and readily available tools, the pencil and gridded paper. They've learned to use the pencil in all its different types of pencils in previous drawing courses, which has taught them this most basic tool, which we then use in the form of typography. I also explain how you have to prepare yourself to undertake this work. And in this sort of digital rapid-paced culture that they've all been bred into, it's really important that they consider the work area that they're working in. They have to prepare this area with tools available in an environment that's conducive to focus and creative flow. They have a shared studio space on campus, and I strongly encourage them to work together rather than at home. And so drawing letters is a very slow and methodical endeavor if it is to be taken seriously, and so I constantly emphasize slow down and pay attention. I source a number of classic texts on hand lettering. This is one of my favorites, Hildegard Korger's Handbook of Type and Lettering. And it's published in German in '86 and in English in 1992. And what I really love about this is that, well, my copy was discarded from the Orange County Public Library, which is really, I think, kind of testament to like that inane rejection of history that has been going on in graphic design in the recent decade, as well as echoed in the United States, now not requiring the teaching of cursive handwriting in K-12 education, which is also kind of ridiculous. Anyway, back to letters. My students understand logic, as I'm sure many of yours do. They've been bred in this rational society that if you follow the rules, you get an A, and everyone gets a trophy. And so in this case, like, what's more logical in this case as a place to start than geometry? And Korger presents the Roman capitals here as a system of geometric proportions with rules that the students can follow, which basically gets them reacquainted with how to draw their own Latin alphabet, or how to write their own Latin alphabet. I also reference Russell Laker's Anatomy of Lettering from 1947, which is an absolutely fabulous book. And he presents the Roman caps in their geometric proportions. He guides the reader through each letter, stroke by stroke, with a lot of really interesting prose thrown in there. It's also important to note that I employ geometry as an entry point into drawing and an understanding of the letter forms. Pure geometric forms, as we probably know, they're sterile. They're void of those optical necessities of good typography. Very much know that. Geometry is just a place to get, it's an entryway. It's the, what do they call that, the feeder drug. Because we all know that pure geometric form has its issues. So I explain how each letter is constructed. The letters are made up from a combination of strokes, with the strokes only made in a top-down, left-to-right sort of calligraphic method. The pen or the pencil is never pushed up. It's only ever pulled down in a series of strokes. I assign them to construct the Roman capitals, the square capitals, in groups of form, starting with the rectilinear forms and moving into the curves. So in these sets, starting with the EFL, THN, moving on through, looking at the letters in that way. I have them draw horizontal lines on a 19-inch gridded paper, and then they construct each letter in the 4-inch square. They use a soft pencil, as I demonstrated in class. And then they very laboriously have to draw 3 letters per sheet. It's very much like, walking around the classroom and yes, no, kind of the old school way of doing it. And so here are some of the straight lines with the ones with the apex and vertices and the combinations of the two. And then they move on to those based on a circle. And they're like, wow, drawing a perfect circle is very difficult. Because remember, these are 4 inches. And then, of course, ending with the dreaded S. And so throughout this process, they tend to complain a lot about the time. They tend to complain a lot about, gosh, my hand hurts. It's like, that's because you're training it to do something. Wrong way. So they're focused on the letter forms. They're focused on steadying the hand. They're focused on quieting the mind. They're focusing really that paying attention and slowing down. And they're obviously not concerning themselves with the space between the letters, only the space within the letter, and the space between the square and the letter itself, and the space that the letter occupies within that square. So then after the exhaustive study of the square caps, we move on to the minuscules, and specifically the Carolingian forms. And I talk about how these were developed over time as a more informal and faster technique of writing. And they like the fact that it might be a little faster. So then therefore the next one is, it's very similar in format to the Roman caps, but it also offers me the opportunity to introduce type anatomy so that we can discuss the letter forms as a group and from across the room. So instead of saying that thingy over there, we can say, oh, you mean the counter. And then also how these lowercase or minuscules have changed from the Roman capitals and how the strokes became abbreviated from the majuscules. Laker is also referenced again. We're still following the strict geometry in the construction of these letter forms. So they continue to group the letters according to the similarity of strokes with the same rigor and attention to technique. Once again, only concerning themselves with the space within the letter form, the relationship between the letter form and the space that it exists within. And of particular note is the two different lowercase g's, because being able to draw and recognize a proper two-story minuscule G is crucial to understanding the differences in typefaces moving forward. So once they master the strokes through practice, practice, and then more practice, I provide them all with a 5mm broad nib marking pen, which represents the traditional flat tip ink nib. And some of you here were in Brody Neuschwander's workshop, and you relate to the stepping up of tools to learn as the learning process. So I demonstrate how the same strokes that they've been practicing over and over again with a pencil can produce all these different results by the different tool that they use, right? So for all of them, this was the, oh my God moment, right? Which is really fun. So yeah, they're totally amazed by this. And by now they've practiced the stroke order, they've practiced the different strokes and the internal geometry, and they just do the same thing but with a different tool, and it produces a different flavor of a letter. I know for us it's like yes, but for them it's like, oh wow. So they're beginning to realize that the form of the letter is directly related to the tool of production, which is kind of the idea, right? I also talk about the density of letter forms as the relationship between the nib thickness and the overall scale. In this case, the median is extended to the 4 nib heights. It's a calligraphic thing above the baseline, and now this is the basis for the forms. And so this becomes, they no longer use graph paper at this point. They're basing their letters off of the nib height, right? So they also try the 5 nib height, and they realize that the letters get weak and unstable. They go down to 3, and then they realize that the letters become illegibly dense because all the counters and bowls get filled. I take time to explain what designates humanist typography and how so much contemporary typography retains these proportions of stroke thickness. From their lettering to Garamond, they see the relationships in terms of the humanist stroke, and how that also continues on into contemporary sans through, represented by Aller and Vista. They start to really see that, oh wow, the stroke does thin out when it touches things like that. So they realize why. And then they can start to identify what makes type humanist versus geometric, and we can actually have a dialogue about this. And then I assign them a phrase to hand letter on a sheet of Bristol. So I use the phrase, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. They're challenged to consider, now they need to consider the space between letters, not just within the letter, and the relationship of that phrase to the page. And this is where I begin to discuss that geometry is only a guide for construction, but the art of typography lies in how you experience it through our visual perception, right? Very far from perfect. But at least they are now beginning to work with kerning, letter spacing, and overall composition. So it's a building up into this. I go further to explain how good typography is not mathematical, with the human hand as the genesis of classic typography, right, if Kadich is right. It offers a variance and opportunities that imbibe human nature into visible language. And as Korger states, complex letters in particular defy strict construction rules. The only reliable guides are examples, experience, and a trained eye. Had to quote her at least once. Finally, I demonstrate brush lettering. I assign them the same phrase to do with a brush on a single sheet of paper. And in this time, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, I ask them to consider the relationship between these two distinct parts. The floating, and how that idea can affect the lettering, and then stinging, and how that can affect the lettering. So again, this is type 1, right? So they had never done lettering before, and this is only maybe a month into the semester. So you can see the relationship between the floating, the more rounded letter forms, the more calligraphic, and then the more rigid and sharp stinging at the bottom. So through the series of assignments, these students are introduced to a number of these typographic skills and an awareness, and a couple of the key points that I have identified. As I said, slowing down to pay attention, how to prepare their tools. That is, Laker says the pencil should be held lightly with no undue pressure ever applied. The forefinger must not be bent as it unconsciously applies this unwelcome pressure and causes fatigue. Seeing letters, ultimately the goal for type 1, not just reading letters, but seeing them. Type anatomy, understand the stem, the shoulder, the spine, the finials, etc. of these letter forms because they felt what it was like to draw them as the primary stem, as the primary stroke, understanding that that is the stem of the letter, and how all the strokes combine and the reason that they combine through their actual hand. Letter form classification. Again, understanding what makes something humanist. Also understanding that as our society became more enlightened, became more modern, more Cartesian, so went our letter forms. And also how history continues to inform type design today. Calligraphy, lettering, and type. It allows me to talk about the distinctions between calligraphy, or letters with a single stroke, lettering, or letters built up from multiple strokes, and type, that mechanized, consistent form of typographic reproduction. Again, and then we then go into the letterpress, and they understand, oh, now all these letters are standardized, but they are based on these forms that were created by the hand. And then, of course, type specification and selection. So no longer will they choose impact to make an impact. Ultimately, they, knowing the origins of letter forms and how history informs typography today. So I also wanted to bridge this into more upper level work. So hopefully you can see how some of the basic fundamentals have continued on into today. Things like spot illustrations, book covers. In my upper level design classes, I give a weekly poster design assignment that every week they bring in a poster. It's for a fictitious band. Due every week, the band travels around the world. I give them a tour dates. And then every poster has different specs. And so this is all hand-rendered, completely 100% hand-rendered. So you see how the hand then comes in more and more. I challenge them to incorporate the venue into their concept, looking at how, again, how the hand it can represent an idea. Each week the assignment's a new recipe of influences with the band as a consistent element. So whether it wants to be more, referential or more sort of down and dirty. As they migrate to use the computer, hopefully they understand why to use it based on the results that a computer produces and the efficiencies it offers. Because as we all know, the computer is really, really great for some things and really, really, really poor at other things. Combining hand lettering with digital set type, this integration of type and image starts to be incorporated more. What does the hand lettering offer you in terms of a communication, in terms of that form? How does that form communicate? What's the role of each of these in the ultimate communication? And hopefully seeing letters as the material of communication, not just as the words, but as a material, just like paper. And some even returning to the primary concept of geometry, but this time reinterpreted as the basis of type design, which seems an appropriate way to sort of come full circle. So thanks.
John Paul, last talker of the session. We'll do the switch over.